Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, for the warm welcome. I think it's also true that there are only 2 people in Scotland from the 1999 intake that are proposing to stand next year, one of whom, of course, is John Swinney, the current First Minister. So you're in fine company. And thank you, Jack, also for that far too warm an introduction. As Jack has said, this election, or the 2 elections, because I'm going to look at both Scotland and at Wales, these elections are taking place in what are frankly unprecedented circumstances. And effectively what I want to do this evening is kind of stand back a little bit from the immediate party politics, although, you know, for those of you for whom that's your principal interest, you will still find plenty of meat. But I want to stand back a little bit and ask some questions about what are the implications for the context and perhaps the aftermath of the 2026 elections, of the circumstances in which we currently find themselves, and what are the implications in particular for the devolution project. Now, there were, of course, many hopes and aspirations for devolution. I'm going to pick out 3 this evening as the criteria that I'm going to use in order to evaluate both what might happen in May and what might be the fallout thereafter. The first, of course, was to provide both Scotland and Wales with a measure of self-government that both involved making it possible for Scotland and Wales to do things differently if they wish to do so, but also through the electoral process to hold, because sometimes the Scottish office and the Welsh office did things differently, but there was no way that voters within Scotland and Wales could particularly judge that. But also because the government is now determined through an electoral process, it's possible for voters in Scotland and Wales to hold those who make these decisions, whether they are or are not to follow Westminster, to hold those politicians to account. And that's one of the important themes that I want to pursue this evening. The second, undoubtedly, was to have a more consensual style of politics than there was at Westminster. That was, as it were, physically embodied in the shape of both the Senedd and of the Scottish Parliament chamber in Edinburgh, whereby it's a circular chamber, and the hope and the expectation was that one of the things about devolution is, in a sense, we talked a lot about creating the assembly as it was then known, creating the parliament. The governments were a little bit of an afterthought, but the thought was therefore we're creating these bodies which collectively will be responsible for governing Scotland and Wales. Now, in the end, we discovered there was a government and therefore power wasn't necessarily evenly distributed, but there was still an expectation that it would be a system whereby politics would not be representing the antagonistic style of Westminster. And the third, at least for many people who were advocates of devolution, is that this was going to be the answer to the problem of the Union. That is, by demonstrating that the United Kingdom could create institutions that reflected the distinctive national identities of both Scotland and of Wales, and at the same time also gave them an opportunity for whereby their rather different, perhaps, needs and aspirations for what they wanted out of their political system, that could indeed be recognised and to some degree realised through the framework of the UK. So one question, therefore, to be asked is, well, where might that project look in the wake of the 2026 elections? Now, why might one pick out these particular criteria? Why might one have concerns given these criteria for the context in which we now find ourselves? Well, the first, of course, is, already talked about it, and I'll go through it very quickly in a moment, there is a lot of discontent with Westminster. To put not too fine a point on it, there's a bit of a crisis of confidence amongst the public about the institutions of the British state and the ability of those institutions to deal with the very substantial policy challenges that the UK faces, one, of course, of which was particularly highlighted today, which is the fiscal and economic situation of the UK. Both Labour and the Conservative parties are deeply unpopular. And the one, therefore, question is, well, at the end of the day, and this is going to be a lot of what I talk about, will in the end, how voters vote in May tell us more about what they think about Westminster than what they think about Cardiff Bay or about Holyrood. The second thing, of course, is that our politics at the UK level have fragmented. The 2024 election was the first election in which 5 political parties fought virtually every constituency in Great Britain, and therefore in Scotland and Wales we had 6 parties contesting. And in particular, this fragmentation has led to the rise of challenger parties, most notably the Reform, now more recently the Greens, and also question marks about what does this also mean we now have a more polarised politics that we might want to come back to. And so I'll be looking to some degree, therefore, to what extent might we find that we end up with more fragmented politics in Scotland and in Wales, and or will we find more polarised politics? And then perhaps also one of the consequences of this fragmentation is it going to open up prospects for the nationalist parties in Scotland and in Wales. Now, just a little bit to elaborate on this. Most of this you'll be aware of, so I'm just going to go through this very quickly, just to make it clear that everybody's common sense wisdom is there in the data. So the first is we have a public that is deeply economically pessimistic, is finding it difficult to deal with the cost of living crisis. This is data from British social attitudes, basically since the financial crash. Are you finding it comfortable or struggling to live on your income? The top line, the top blue line, are the people who say they are comfortable. That's been falling. The bottom line, which has gradually been rising, are those folk who say they are struggling. We are now finding it much more difficult to cope economically as individuals as we once were. And there are lots of other data out there showing the deep pessimism of the British public about the economy and their economic situation. The second, of course, is the state of the National Health Service. Again, this is British social attitudes, all the way back to 1983. The blue line are the people who are satisfied with NHS. The red line are those who are dissatisfied. We grumbled about the health service in the 1990s. It was, frankly, largely fixed by New Labour, by both targets and by putting more money into the service. But in the wake of the pandemic, satisfaction with the health service, which largely survived the so-called years of Cameron Osborne austerity, but it didn't survive the pandemic, and we are now more dissatisfied with the health service than we have ever been, certainly since that measure's been available. We're also, of course, having lots of arguments about immigration. The UK has experienced record levels of both legal, quote-unquote, and illegal, quote-unquote, immigration in recent years, despite Brexit. This is data about whether or not what people think about the economic consequences of Brexit, of immigration, again from British social attitudes. The story is actually a bit more complicated than you might imagine. The right-hand side of this graph is telling you that indeed we are now less likely to think that migration is economically beneficial than was the case a few years ago. But actually, we are still more likely to think migration is economically beneficial than was the case in the first decade of this century, when we were very dubious about immigration. So the story is a bit more complicated, but there is undoubtedly been something of a reaction against recent experience. These perceptions are also to be found in Scotland and in Wales. These are the perceptions of the health service. This comes data from the British election study in the spring of this year. As you can see, more or less the proportion of people who think that the economy is getting a lot worse or getting a little worse is pretty much the same in Scotland and in Wales as it is in England. There isn't much difference on this. We are all unhappy about the state of the economy. On the health service, there's a bit of a difference. People are a little less critical in England than they are in Scotland and in Wales. And Wales does come out slightly higher, though not as much as you might expect from some of the political discourse. But again, it's a common problem. So those general issues that face the UK as a whole are also perceptions that are widely held within Scotland and in Wales. The 2024 result, meanwhile, election result, did produce already, but leaving aside where we're at the moment, itself produced highly fragmented politics. We had more parties we actually have 14 parties represented inside the House of Commons now, more than ever before. Labour might have won a parliamentary landslide, but their share of the vote was a record low. All sorts of records were frankly broken in 2024. But what's also true about 2024, and this is one of the ways in which we can get at this issue of polarisation, is that our politics across the UK are no longer unidimensional. Now, arguably in Scotland and Wales, they were already not unidimensional because, of course, apart from the argument between the economic left and the economic right, which is an argument essentially about inequality and what the state should do about it, there is also the constitutional question, to which attitudes to some degree cut across the left-right divide. But what's also happened to our politics, it's not unique to the UK, but it's certainly been put on speed by the Brexit debate, is the second debate which we can talk about is the difference between libertarians and authoritarians, social liberals or social conservatives. It's the culture wars debate. It's the debate about immigration, about equalities policies, about whether or not we apologise for Britain's past, etc., etc. These issues have now become as strongly related to voting behaviour across the UK as have the argument between left and right. So the left-hand side of this graph is showing you the extent to which, for example, support for Labour, surprise, surprise, is 25 points higher amongst those people who are on the left than amongst those who are on the right. And the opposite is true for the Conservatives. But notice that particularly when it comes to reform, reform are defined not by particularly economically right-wing amongst their electorate, as opposed to being very socially conservative. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have got the Greens, who are also clearly demarcated by being socially liberal, along with the Liberal Democrats, but the secret there is in the name, as well as also the Greens being markedly much more higher popular amongst those on the left than the right. So you can see, therefore, that our politics is no longer unidimensional. And one of the reasons why, therefore, our politics is fragmenting is because it becomes much more difficult to maintain a two-party system across the UK if you've got more than two dimensions in your politics, and when those two dimensions are, for the most part, not correlated with each other. You can be left-wing and socially conservative. See the Home Secretary, for example. Being on the left doesn't mean to say that you're social liberal. Now, one of the things that's crucial about why this is also important is that attitudes towards Brexit are very strongly correlated to that second culture wars dimension. They are not correlated with whether you're on the left or the right. People on the left were just as likely to vote Leave as those people on the right. And that therefore, when you look at attitudes towards Brexit, it may not be being talked about a great deal, but they still very heavily structured party support at the last election. And the point is that Brexit becomes a very useful indicator, which I can now be able to use in Scotland and in Wales, a very clear indicator of the extent to which our politics are potentially being polarised and being fragmented by this second dimension. So as you can see, first of all, for the most part, what happened in 2024 is that reform took about a half of the vote that of the Leave vote, the pro-Brexiteers that were Conservative supporters in 2019. The support for reform is very, very heavily embedded amongst those who want to be outside the European Union. The Labour Party had a little bit of relative success amongst Leave voters, but not very much. Its support was still very heavily concentrated amongst rejoiners, as is also true and became much more clearly true of the Greens. So you can already see, although not being talked about, how the second dimension was still very clearly fragmenting and potentially polarising our politics in 2024. So hang on to that, because I'm going to be coming back to later on in the lecture. So, since then, of course, GB-wide politics has become very, very different. This is the timeline of how the polls have changed since July of last year, and we have now had 7 months of reform being ahead. The red line, as you can see, is the Labour Party's vote, just gradually, persistently declining. No immediate cause, no immediate event caused it. It's just been a gradual and persistent process. The Conservative Party, having had a little bit of recovery in the autumn of last year, are now down to around 18%, even less than they had in 2024. And meanwhile, most recently, the advent of Zach Polanski as the leader of the reform of the Greens in England and Wales has now seen them just begin to overtake the Liberal Democrats. So we now have both those challenger parties, relatively speaking, doing well. And the Greens are at an all-time high for the party, and Reform, of course, are also at that kind of level. So we now have 5 parties, all of whom are at 12% or more. Our politics at GB level, at least, are highly fragmented. What's going on here? And again, I want you to hang on to this and remember some of this, because I'm going to do the contrast with Scotland and with Wales. Where is Reform's vote coming from? Since 2024, same place it came from during 2024. It's coming primarily from the Conservatives. 1 in 3 of the people who voted Conservative last year, a much diminished band as they were, have now switched to Reform. That means that over half of the people who voted Conservative in 2019 are now Reform supporters. Yes, Labour are losing some ground to Reform, and they weren't losing any last year, but it's a much smaller flow. Indeed, what the Labour's problem is that their vote is going all over the place across the UK as a whole. Yes, they're losing some support to Reform, but they're losing just as much support to the Greens, and of course they're losing some support to the Democrats as well. And in fact, you can show very, very clearly it's Labour's pro-Brexit voters who are going to Reform, a minority group as they are, and it is Labour's pro-EU voters who are going to the Greens and the Democrats. And the point is the culture wars issues are structuring the fragmentation of Labour's votes. So this is again why the advent of this second dimension matters. One other thing we can say, perhaps say straight away. This is now taking the implications of those flows for the relationship between vote and party support across the UK. And if there is one figure I want you to remember tonight, in order to be able to understand where we are politically, it is that support for Reform is now running at over 50% amongst those people who voted for Leave. It very, very heavily structures Reform support. And basically what has happened is that the Johnsonian coalition, the people who voted for Boris Johnson to get Brexit done in 2019, have now been, Nigel Farage will say, I've taken them back. I gave them to Boris, he let us down, I've now got them back. But you'll see therefore how, in fact now, whereas support for Leave Leave voters became somewhat fragmented and depolarised in their voting preferences last year, it's now very much firmly again. Most Leave voters are either Reform supporters or some of them are Conservative supporters. And meanwhile, you can see on the other end of the spectrum how both the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are primarily gaining ground amongst Remain voters, and how Labour are just seeing their vote from both halves of the Brexit divide being eroded away in those opposite directions. So the Brexit divide, if anything, is now very clearly structurally changing the character of politics across the UK as a whole. Now, it's one thing to talk about the popularity of parties, but it's something else to look at because it's relevant to polarisation. But what is the level of antipathy? And I've already seen, you don't surprise me, I've already seen 1 or 2 people rolling their eyes and frowning their brows as I tell you that Reform are doing rather well in certain sections of the electorate. You get that reaction quite often. And you can see here why. So this is actually looking data at how many people say they actually strongly dislike a party. nobody dislikes the Liberal Democrats, or virtually nobody dislikes the Liberal Democrats, you know. So the point is they may not be very popular, but they're not very unpopular either, all right? They're everybody's second choice. You can see also it's one of the advantages of Plaid. Not many people hate Plaid. They might be indifferent to them, but again, it's only 18% of people who say they hate them. And the Greens do reasonably well at this end of the spectrum as well. So although the Greens might be thought to be a polarising force, well, actually, not necessarily that much. But then look to see, well, the SNP, yeah, somewhat a degree of antipathy there. But then look to see what is true of Reform. So Reform might be the most popular party across the UK as a whole, and question mark in Wales. We'll come to that in a moment. But you can see that across, in Scotland, 50% of people say they really dislike them, and the figures are running at around 40% or more in Wales. So you can see, therefore, how, for many people, Reform are beyond the pale. And that raises questions about what will be the relationship between Reform, MSs and MSPs, if indeed there are substantial phalanxes of them in the two chambers in May. Because certainly for many people in the electorate, they are, as it were, not people that they would want their representatives that they have voted for to be bargaining and engaging with. So you can certainly see one of the ways in which here, if indeed Reform are going to do well, how this might create a rather more polarised situation. You already know you've got a new electoral system, all right? What I do need to remind you is that Scotland is keeping the existing system, and that does therefore mean that in Scotland, as in the old system in Wales, but it's not quite so dominant, but it still matters, that the majority of seats in Scotland will be elected by first past the post. Just again, that's one of those things to hang on to, because I'm going to come back to the implications of that later on, because it does potentially matter whether or not the new Welsh system is more or less proportional than the previous one. I think we can have a fascinating debate for hours, and I see there are various members of the Electoral Reform Society in the back of the room, but I'm sorry, guys, I'm not going to go into that one now. The point is that the system in Wales is not that proportional. That's what you need to hang on to. So let's now, first of all, look at, with all of this in mind, look at Wales, and then I will come to Scotland. So one of the things, of course, we should note about Wales is that there being a wee bit of bother for Labour was already evident last year. Support for Labour in Wales at 37% was barely higher than it was across the UK as a whole, or indeed in Scotland, where it was also 35%. Support for Labour in Wales fell. Of course, it was part of a broader pattern. The Scottish Government, people voted against that. The government in London, people voted against that. Being in government, for the most part, is not a very good idea at the moment if you want to be an electorally successful politician. That was certainly one of the lessons of last year. So there were already signs of perhaps Labour being a problem. Reform equally, however, in line with the relative success of UKIP in Wales and the level of support for Leave in Wales, again, actually doing slightly better than across the UK as a whole. So already very clear signs of Reform potentially being significant players. And yet at the same time also, Plaid, for whom Westminster elections always was a bit more of a challenge, well, they managed to defeat the boundary commissioners and they still hang on to their 4 seats, but actually in doing so got a record share of the vote for a Westminster election. So the challenges to Labour, the signs were already there, as indeed, frankly, they were already there across the UK as a whole. This is what we've got in the way of polling for next year for the Senate. It is limited. Not all the polls entirely agree with each other. This is simply an arithmetic average of the most recent polls by the 4 companies that have been doing something in Wales. You can first of all see how potentially fragmented the result is. It suggests that it's a battle between Reform and Plaid as to who comes first, with Labour seemingly running in 3rd place. If you don't believe that, I will simply say Labour at 19% across the UK as a whole, and given the 2024 baseline, why should we expect the position in Wales to be that different from the position across the UK as a whole? And that, of course, why, again, I think we can have a debate about this. I would argue it would be the first time that Labour would lose an election since 1931, because Labour didn't get most seats in 1931. So anyway, you can already see how, therefore, about all my criteria, apparently UK-wide politics may be having an influence. It looks like potentially perhaps a more polarised position with the arrival of reform. And also you can see maybe there's a boost here for a nationalist party. Now, however, is the underlying dynamics? Are they the same as the dynamics that I've shown you for Britain as a whole? The answer is they are not exactly the same. I've already shown you that across Britain as a whole, Reform are primarily taking votes off the Tories, but that is even more clearly the case so far as Wales is concerned, according to the polling that we have got. And equally, Labour's problem in Wales is more straightforward. It's called Plaid, full stop. Reform are not taking as much support from Labour in Wales as it is across Britain as a whole. And to that extent, at least, the UK-wide politics, if they're having influence, they're not necessarily being played out in the same way in Wales as it would be on the other side of the border. So there are some differences here. But then, what we can also then show is, however, is what is going on to the relation with Brexit. And I've explained why I'm looking at this. This is my indicator of where people are on that second dimension. Well, one thing is now familiar. You can see how Labour's vote is being fragmented in both directions. You can again see that Reform's dominance of the 2016 Leave vote is almost as strong in Wales as it is across Britain as a whole. And you can see that the rise in Plaid support is very heavily concentrated amongst those on the Remain side of the spectrum. And that's why Labour's vote is particularly down so heavily amongst those who voted against Brexit. So that second dimension divide is again very clearly being played out. And again, you can see how, in a sense, to use a Yeatsian notion, the centre cannot hold, i.e. the Labour Party, against the forces that are moving voters in either the direction of reform or against Plaid, although in some respects the rise of reform is happening in a way from the Conservatives that Labour can't do anything about. Okay. What about holding folk accountable? This is the most complicated graph of the evening, so I'm going to walk you through this one because there are going to be quite a few like this. And so if you've got this one, you'll get quite a lot of the other things I'm going to do. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking 2024 Labour voters in Wales, okay? And I am dividing them up according to how well they think the health service is doing. And this is the data I showed you earlier when I compared England, Scotland and Wales. The 27 means that if I voted Labour last year, and I think the health service is a lot worse, there's only a 27% chance that I would vote Labour again. Whereas if, for example, I think the health service is at least no worse these days than it was in an unspecified time in the question, there's about a 60% chance that I will vote Labour again. Notice, and this is not unimportant, that switching to reform is correlated with discontent with the state of the health service. Support for reform is ideologically embedded amongst people who are socially conservative, but they're also being pushed in that direction by their lack of confidence in traditional governing institutions, in this case, Labour. Equally, if we do the same analysis on the economy, we get a similar picture. only about a 20% chance of voting Labour again if you think the economy is a lot worse. 68% if it's at least thought to be the same. And given I've shown you how many people are unhappy with the health service and how many people are unhappy with the economy, including amongst 2024 Labour voters, you will see why Labour have a wee bit of a problem in Wales. But of course, what this data doesn't enable me to do is to work out who is being blamed. Is it the government in London, or is it the government here in Cardiff? Because, of course, they both have the same political stripe. When I come to Scotland in a moment, I will be able to make that distinction, but I can't using these data. So somebody is being held to account for the state of the country, but who is it? Well, one of the ways I can at least begin to get into that is to look to see what people in Wales say when they're asked about, and this again is 2024 Labour voters, what do they say when they're being asked as to how good or bad a job or whether they approve or disapprove of the record of the UK government and of the Welsh government. And as you can see, although evaluations of the Welsh government are not exactly a 10 out of 10 billing, there are basically as many people who 2024 Labour voters, remember, who disapprove of the record of the Welsh government as approve of it. Their perception of the Labour government is even worse. I mean, just think about it, it's staggering. Nearly a half of the people who voted Labour last year, diminished as they were in Wales, disapprove of the record of the government in London. I'm going to come back to comparing the evaluation of the Welsh government a little bit later, because I can compare the position in Scotland. What is also true is, again, doing that same kind of analysis. So what's your probability of being willing to vote Labour again? Yes, it's true on the right-hand side that if you disapprove of the record of the Welsh government, you are less likely to say you'll vote Labour again than if you think it's doing okay. But the link is stronger for UK Labour. So I'm not suggesting that the Welsh government evaluations don't matter, but it does look as though, given that there are more people who are unhappy about the UK government and that the relationship is stronger, that it's probably primarily London that are doing it. We should, of course, not ignore the constitutional question. There are many of those being asked on Welsh polls of different varieties. This is simply the probability that you're going to vote for independence, no change. Right? And it hasn't changed since 2019. That won't surprise you. But then there is the other question to ask about polarisation is, well, where are we at now so far as the link between attitudes towards the Constitution and how you're going to vote? Now, these data are not the way round I wanted them, but I'm afraid no, it doesn't mean to say the results are wrong. What I mean is what I wanted to show you is the proportion of people who would vote Conservative or Labour broken down by their constitutional preference. But I can't do that for recent commercial polling data. And the British election study didn't ask the right question last spring. Therefore, I've got to take the data the other way around. Now, the point is, yes, there is a degree of polarisation. There are, support for abolition of the Assembly is high. It's just as high amongst reform voters as it is amongst Conservative voters. And equally, support for independence, surprise, surprise, is highest amongst Plaid voters. And Labour voters tend to want more powers. What you can do, however, and that's what the note at the bottom says, is, well, if we take, even with the data that way round, and we compare the numbers with the numbers in the same polling just before the 2024 election, what you discover is the relationship is very similar. In other words, it's not clear, despite the change in the party structure, it's not clear that the relationship between party support and this display of attitude. So the proportion of Plaid supporters who are in favour of independence is just the same now as it was back a year ago. This is not a forecast. It's a projection. It's a crucial distinction, okay? But it's just basically taking those polling numbers. There are a number of, Jack's got one, there are numerous projection facilities out there. They don't all agree with each other, by the way. This seems to be roughly the consensus. I mean, surprise, surprise. We think that maybe Reform might get most seats, question mark, question mark. But of course, the crucial thing is that Reform plus the Conservatives, who are the only people who are likely to vote for Reform First Minister, does not have a majority, whereas Plaid plus Labour would. Ergo, we are probably heading for a Plaid First Minister, assuming Plaid can remain ahead of Labour. Are we looking for more fragmented politics? Well, this is a technical measure from political science literature about how fragmented politics are, both in terms of the vote and in terms of the seats. Broadly speaking, I think the message is it's certainly going to be as fragmented as it has been, but not necessarily more fragmented it has been, at least in terms of votes. Okay, Scotland. Labour in Scotland, you could feel them after their success. And Scotland was the one place where there really was a dramatic improvement in Labour's position. You could feel the folk around Anna Sarwar, the Scottish Labour leader, measuring the curtains and the carpets in Bute House, which is the 10 Downing Street of Edinburgh. And it was palpable. I was at another event just a few weeks ago with quite a lot of devolved politicians around. The mood was completely different. But you can see why Labour were so optimistic. This is now the position. It is not the case that there has been some great revival of the SNP, right? The SNP got 30%. Last year, if you take Westminster voting intentions at the moment, it's 32. But whereas they were behind the Labour Party last year, they're now well ahead. Indeed, they have a double-digit lead in Holyrood voting intentions over everybody else, particularly on the constituency vote. Reform are not as popular in Scotland. There are few Labour voters in Scotland, but they are doing well enough to fragment the unionist vote north of the border. What is the pattern of movement? And again, it is somewhat different, both from England and from Wales. It is true that Reform are taking most support from the Conservatives, but frankly, there weren't that many Conservatives left to take votes from north of the border for that to be a very strong wellspring. What they are taking votes off Labour, and I'll say a bit more about that tomorrow, but notice they're taking nothing off the SNP. So Reform have fragmented the nationalist opposition, leaving the SNP in a much stronger position. But what is true is that the figure for Labour, although it's less than that for the Tories, Labour in Scotland are losing more votes to Reform than they are to anybody else. And the explanation is that the Labour vote in Scotland is less left-wing. They were particularly successful in picking up votes from the Tories last year, but that therefore means that this is a vote that is much more vulnerable to Reform now that Reform are rising and have been rising north of the border. You can also see that Reform's vote in Scotland, yeah, it's embedded in the Leave vote, but it's not quite so strongly embedded in the Leave vote. But again, you can see Labour's vote is just fragmenting on both sides of the Brexit divide. And again, you can see that the SNP, the Greens, insofar as they're making any progress, and the Democrats are tending to pick up Remain voters. So again, the divide is becoming quite clear and quite sharp. Now, who's being held to account north of the border? So the first thing to say is that quite remarkably, I mean, normally as political scientists, we say, if you ask people how well the country's doing, the folk who support the party that's in government will say it's doing brilliantly, and the folk who are in opposition will say it's doing awfully. There's no sign of this. These are perceptions in Scotland of the state of the economy. All voters, the blue bar, Labour voters from last year, the red bar, and SNP voters, the green bar. Everybody agrees. The economy in Scotland is doing badly. So it's not as though there is some big perceptual gap going on here. But who do they blame? Now remember how to read these graphs, right? The heart of the graph tells you the probability that a set of folk will vote for a party going. Now I'm looking at 2024 SNP voters. And I'm breaking them down according to what they regard as the state of the economy. You've got it. There's no difference. 2024 SNP voters are not holding the SNP government to account for the state of the economy. Whereas, you've guessed it, 2024 Labour voters think it's Labour's fault because they're much less willing to vote Labour again. Now, at this point, you might reasonably say, well, but hang on, look, let's be realistic here, most of the policy levers about the economy are at Westminster. What about the health service? Because that's devolved. Surely. That's the Scottish. I mean, Anna Sawa spends every 5 minutes First Minister's questions banging on about the terrible state of the health service north of the border. Well, there is agreement that the health service is not doing terribly well. Both Labour voters and SNP voters agree with the general Scottish public that it's not doing terribly well. But, well, the SNP voters who think that the health service is actually getting better, and there aren't very many of them, it's about 1 in 5, they are somewhat more likely to vote SNP again. But otherwise, it makes no difference. Whose fault is the health service? Sorry. It's Keir Starmer's fault. I don't know why Anna Sawa keeps on banging on about it. He's not doing him any good at all. And again, notice how Reform are picking up the voters who are unhappy with the health service. The folk who are going to the SNP from Labour are small, will be folk who actually think the NHS is doing quite well. So they're willing to credit the SNP. So the problem, so here, in other words, the evidence is much sharper. That indeed, that in Scotland at least, it is the UK government and perceptions of the UK government that is primarily being held to account rather than the devolved administration. You can see this with other data. You can see, for example, that SNP voters are on balance willing to trust the SNP to make the right decisions on the economy and on health, whereas 2024 Labour voters are on balance not willing to trust the Labour Party to make the right decisions on the economy and on health. Equally, also, again, doing a similar analysis that I did for Wales, how good or bad or job do you think the UK government is doing, the left-hand side, the Scottish government on the right-hand side? Both get a negative press by voters in general, but 2024 Labour voters give UK Labour a really negative press, whereas 2024 SNP voters, that's the far right-hand side, I think the SNP are doing a good job. And this is now also where we can compare the evaluations in Wales with the evaluations in Scotland, because I've now shown you them separately, so let's bring them together. And again, this is using a common source. So as you can see, as you saw earlier, as you've already seen, SNP voters evaluate the Scottish government on balance positively, whereas in Wales, it's Labour voters, basically it's even Stevens. And that therefore, as a result, you can see how, relatively speaking at least, the record of the Welsh government is one that is causing more difficulty for Labour than is the perceived record of the SNP government north of the border. And then equally also, again, taken data that came out very, very recently for both Scotland and Wales, you can see how, again, amongst their own voters, the Scottish government is thought to have doing a good job. The same is not true of Labour voters in Wales. Finally, attitudes to independence, of course, is a much more pertinent issue north of the border. This is the level of support for yes or no. Since last year's general election, Labour hoped that as a result of getting rid of that nasty Tory government in London, allegedly, that voters in Scotland would say, okay, it's all fine now to be inside the Union, we don't need independence. You don't need to know which is yes and which is no. The crucial point is that it's going nowhere, and it's going nowhere at around 50-50. Scotland is still more or less evenly divided on the constitutional question. What has been true in Scotland, and this is where perhaps we're going to be a little bit less polarised, is that politics in Scotland had become very, very strongly polarised around the constitutional question. In the last devolved election in 2021, virtually everybody who was a yes supporter voted for the SNP, and virtually nobody who was a no supporter voted for the SNP. A very, very different situation from the one in 2011, when nearly 2 in 5 of people who were opposed to independence voted for the SNP. But as you already would have guessed from the fact that support for independence is 50%, and support for the SNP is much lower than that. In last year's election, although unionists are still not voting for the SNP, the ability of the SNP to get nationalists to vote for them was diminished. That is still true, but notice again confirmation as to how Reform are fragmenting the unionist vote. They are not picking up very much votes from the yes side of the argument. And you can see why Labour hope that they will be able to take votes off both the Greens and the Labour Party. And that's what's likely to happen in Edinburgh. Almost undoubtedly, the SNP will be not only the largest party, but comfortably the largest party. Probably slightly fewer seats than they've got at the moment, if polls remain as they are. But this is where the electoral system becomes crucial. The SNP, with a geographically evenly spread vote and having a double-digit lead, are likely to pick up the vast bulk of the first-past-the-post seats, ergo being able to win quite comfortably. But it will still mean that Scotland has a more fragmented system, at least in terms of votes, than has been true in the past because of the rise of Reform. So it looks as though these devolved elections are going to be heavily influenced by perceptions of what's going on at Westminster. At the same time, we are probably looking to elections that are at least as fragmented as they ever have been. And at least on some criteria, the politics look potentially to be more polarised. And of course, what it has potentially opened up is, well, we've already got Michelle O'Neill in Belfast. We've already got John Swinney in Edinburgh, and likely still to have John Swinney in Edinburgh. We may now also have a Plaid leader as First Minister in Wales, which means we will have a trio of nationalist First Ministers, which was not what devolution was meant to achieve.